Vladimir Putin's Russia is shifting focus. After years spent fighting a difficult battle in Ukraine and well over a decade propping up key allies in the Middle East, the rapid worldwide changes of the last few months have brought Moscow new challenges and new opportunities. Today, hidden amongst the shifting sands of the Libyan desert, Russia is moving quickly to take advantage. As the world watches transfixed by the outcome of the war in Ukraine and keen viewers track the fate of Russian vassal nations all over the world, the changes in Libya have gone almost entirely unnoticed. But among the pieces being shifted across Vladimir Putin's grand global chessboard is the Libyan element that may prove most important of all. What Russia's doing there and what Russia plans to do there will set the course for decades of the nation's future on the global stage. To understand the relevance of what's going on between Russia and Libya, we've got to understand the much broader global context surrounding Russia right now, and do bear with us for this bit, because it's going to be very important as we go on. If we zoom all the way out, we can think of Russia's approach to the world as a series of three concentric rings, each spreading further and further out from the Russian homeland. These three rings we'll call near Russian affairs, sphere of influence affairs, and frontier affairs. First, we'll take a look at the near Russian ring. This is where we find places like the ex-Soviet states of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, places like Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Belarus, or most importantly, Ukraine. In the near Russia ring, things are moving very quickly at the time of writing, with the new American administration pushing for a peace in Ukraine that would, by all outward indicators, be very favourable to Russia. After an incredible set of expenses of human lives, military equipment, economic stability, Russia's on the cusp of a Pyrrhic victory. Secure that, and Russia will soon be able to pivot into new short-term opportunities, strengthening and rebuilding its military, taking advantage of economic resources in the Donbass region, and working to minimize collateral damage on the home front after the many sacrifices the nation has had to make to sustain its war efforts. Today's sponsor is Incogni. Your personal data is everywhere out there, and you probably don't even realize it. Look, when big companies get hacked, which happens often, I always remember, this was like a decade ago now, but that when Sony got hacked because they made that North Korea movie. But more recent ones, BT Group had that ransomware attack, and just tons of data gets stolen and harvested all the time, and then basically it gets sold to these shady data broker sites. And people buy your data, like email, phone number from these data broker sites, and then they use that email and phone number to basically hassle the shit out of you, which makes life miserable, doesn't it? But you can prevent some of that with Incogni. Incogni automates the process of getting your personal info removed from these shady sites, which saves you time, it saves you effort, and it keeps you, most importantly, protected. So take your personal data back using Incogni. Just use the code WarFronts at incogni.com/warfronts and you get 60% off an annual plan. Thanks to them for sponsoring. And now back to it. In Russia's broader sphere of influence, it's looking at a somewhat less favorable situation. Starting in the east, China and its own proxy, North Korea, have lent Russia considerable support during its war in Ukraine. But other than its nuclear arsenal, Russia has only limited means to present itself as a direct partner for China. Economically, and to an increasing extent militarily, it's at risk of playing second fiddle between a rising power that Russia needs to be close with, more so than China needs to be close to Russia. Moving westward, Russia's attempts to grow closer to Iran have gone well, but they've produced diminishing results as Iran's own rapid collapse of its proxy network in the Middle East has made a less valuable ally. Meanwhile, Bashar al-Assad, a Syrian leader who Russia spent decades propping up, has been toppled, and Turkey, a nation that's been far closer to Russia than the rest of NATO, is growing the confidence to operate alone and at times even against Russian interests. Finally, continental Europe is shaking the cobwebs off of its long-dormant military-industrial complex, pivoting towards what could soon be a staunch defense against Russia if the continent only has a few years to get itself in order. Finally, at the far frontiers of Russian global influence, there's some good and some bad. Russia's operations in Africa have brought setbacks, but its alliances in the Sahel and Central Africa are still paying dividends, while the military government of Sudan may prove to be a longer-term ally. In South Asia, Russia is growing ever closer to Myanmar, while Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro appears as if he'll keep hold of his nation, a rare Russian vassal in Latin America. It's in the farther-flung corners of Russia's influence campaign abroad where we find the nation of Libya. Ravaged by back-to-back civil wars during the 2010s, the nation has been split in two since about 2020. It's ruled in its west by an internationally recognized government out of the city of Tripoli and ruled in its east by a faction under the ultimate control of a warlord named Khalifa Haftar. For all intents and purposes, this half of Libya is in a military dictatorship, and its leader has been engaged in efforts to renew his relationship with Russia over the last couple of years. High-profile Russian leaders have visited Haftar and his government several times since 2023, and Russia is known to be deepening its military cooperation with that half of the divided nation. So, on the subject of Russian military cooperation, there's one more subject that we need to touch on before we can get into the weeds, and that's the Wagner Group. Following the mercenary organization's disastrous mutiny in 2023, it's gone through a series of changes, but it certainly has not disappeared. These days, Wagner fighters fall mostly under the dominion of Russia's Africa Corps, a structure that allows Russia to directly regulate and exercise authority over the former mercenaries. Meanwhile, those ex-mercenaries still keep many of their same traditions, units, iconography, and that sort of thing, while operating in roughly the same way that Wagner did before its change in leadership. The organization is present all across Africa, and it maintains a strong presence in Libya, including military facilities at a minimum of 4 air bases across the country, and a more significant presence at the Al-Qadim airbase near the Mediterranean coast, where Russia maintains a military logistics hub. Ex-Wagner elements have been powerful for some time in Libya, and the Russian military is believed to use the nation's territory to smuggle weapons into Sudan in support of both sides of the civil war that rages there. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. So, it's against the backdrop of a rapidly evolving Russian place on the world stage that we can finally zero in on what's actually going on in Libya. Over the last couple of months, Libya has turned into a hive of Russian activity. Nothing explosive, nothing that would make global headlines, but certainly enough for close observers to realize that something was up. To start the cascade, Russian aircraft began making regular visits to the Al-Qadim airbase, that logistics hub, in late December, running shuttle trips back and forth from Syria. A total of 11 round-trip flights were tallied between late December 2024 and mid-January of this year, mostly leveraging Russia's most capable, widely available strategic airlifter, the Ilyushin IL-76. For reference, that aircraft can carry 60,000 kilograms of cargo or 130,000 pounds on a given flight. Other Russian jets have made similar trips to 2 other Libyan bases. Meanwhile, a Russian cargo ship called the Sparta mysteriously cut its transponder off the coast of eastern Libya for a span of 4 days in what's widely believed to have been a much larger delivery to the Libyan coast. None of that is normal traffic for Libya, where Russian forces are certainly present but typically operate with a light touch. Even more evidence that something's up comes from satellite imagery depicting an airbase in the southeast of the country called Matan al-Sarraj. A relic of the war Libya fought with Chad back in the 1980s, Matan al-Sarraj has been in a state of disrepair since the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011. Per the satellite imagery in question, Russia has now redeployed significant assets to the airbase and is in the process of rebuilding it. Leveraging both alleged Russian personnel and people who seem to be ex-officers of the former Syrian military regime, Russia has repaved the airbase's runway and renovated storage facilities that had previously fallen into disrepair. Other elements of a functional airbase, like a control tower and garrison housing, have yet to be built. According to sources on the ground speaking with international media, troops loyal to Khalifa Haftar have traveled to the area in order to secure the airbase, while Russia has reportedly established positive relations with nearby local tribes. The Prime Minister of Libya's internationally recognized Tripoli government has stated his government's public opposition to a greater Russian presence in the region, citing concerns that Libya would become, quote, a battlefield between countries. But those objections have been ignored, and an airbase that once served as a prized possession of the Libyan Air Force appears to be entirely under Russian control. And a range of other signs and signals suggest that Russia's build-up in Libya is nowhere near complete. Satellite imagery taken of Russian assets in Syria show dismantled attack helicopters and advanced S-400 air defense systems seeming to be readied for transition to Libya on one of the same series of flights that we mentioned a moment ago. Across Syria, Russian military convoys are bringing more and more equipment back to the country's two major bases in the country's east, where those same shuttle flights are still running back and forth. Nearby in northern Chad, Russia's Africa Corps have started to set up transmission systems and radar installations at a base as part of what appears to be an Africa Corps expansion into the nation. Finally, on March 3rd, Libya's National Oil Corporation, based in Tripoli but predominantly relying on oil fields under the Haftar government's control, announced that for the first time in 17 years, the country would accept new bids for oil exploration. Those bids are not guaranteed to result in contracts handed out to Russia, and they'd face stiff competition from European companies, but Russia's oil laundering operations around the world have been a massive revenue generator for Moscow in the face of international sanctions. Having formal or informal access to Libya's immense oil reserves would be a massive advantage for Moscow. Put all those indicators together and the overall picture is clear. Russia is looking to move major assets from Syria to Libya. It's looking to set up shop there for the medium to long term, and it's not just looking to park a token presence there. It's looking to do something with significant investments of personnel and equipment to show for it. Russia has secured the backing of the local government, run by a warlord whose international position is shaky at best and who would benefit greatly by a strong backing from Russia. And there's a financial incentive too, in the form of potential oil contracts. Suffice it to say, Russia is building something in Libya, but why? And why does it matter? If you remember back to a few moments ago when we did the foreign affairs equivalent of a massive exposition dump and said that it would be important later, well, now it's later. Even better, it's time to start drawing so many connections between the people and places involved that you'd think we're vigilantes trying to hunt down a serial killer. Libya isn't just a new Russian hotspot, it's a node in the network, and it's the sort of node that a whole lot of other connections have to flow through on their way down the connective chain back to Moscow. Let's start with Syria, and specifically the reason why so much Russian kit is being transferred out of the country. After the fall of Syria's longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad, Russian military assets in the country were in trouble. They'd been used to prop up the Assad regime directly and often quite violently during a civil war that was incredibly dark, even on the spectrum of civil wars. The new administration, made up of former rebel leaders from a coalition that had overthrown Assad, was obviously not particularly keen on playing nice with Moscow. In the weeks after Assad fell, and even during his final days in power, Russian troops began moving military assets at a frantic pace from where they'd been deployed all across the Syrian nation. Those assets traveled to one of two major bases, a large airbase in the province of Latakia and a large naval base in the province of Tartus, both on the Mediterranean coast. There, Russia could at least be sure that waves of Syrian anti-Assad fighters couldn't outright overwhelm their people in a show of force that Russia realistically had to worry was coming. Since then, tensions with the new leadership in Damascus have ebbed and flowed. On the one hand, Damascus has not been particularly nice in its characterization of Russia's involvement in the civil war. It's intercepted or prevented the movement of Russian convoys within the country, while others have to be escorted by Syrian security personnel. On the other, it's proven willing to work with Russia around its two biggest bases, with Syrian interim leader Ahmad al-Sharaa expressing that he'd allow the base in Latakia to be leased indefinitely and the base in Tartus to remain operational with some changes to the current arrangement. In exchange, Russia could provide diplomatic support and a whole lot of money, but Russian equipment was already moving out of the country before those negotiations were publicized, and it's still moving out of the country now in what appears to be a reflection of a much broader reality. Russia's bases in Tartus and Latakia were once stable assets, and now they aren't, even if the new Syrian leadership is playing nice for now. Instead, it appears that Russia wants to build something equivalent or better in Libya. And to understand why that's so important for Russia, we need to look south. Russia's operations across Africa are critical for the Putin regime. They allow Moscow to acquire streams of critical minerals and other hard resources, and often have a significant cash benefit to come along with them. They allow Russia to build influence all across Africa, which itself is helpful when trying to justify Russian actions in front of the international community, where Russia can count on those same African nations for support. But Russia can't sustain those operations if it has to fly its aircraft all the way from Russian territory to places like Mali or the Central African Republic. The planes Russia uses just can't fly that far while carrying significant payloads, and since many of the nations Russia works with are landlocked, it can't rely on ships to make up the difference. For years, Syria has been the critical waypoint that's allowed Russia to send aircraft down to Africa, touching in Latakia and refueling before continuing their journey southward. It's a logistics problem. Without a waypoint, Russia can't provide meaningful support to its partners in Africa, no matter how badly it wants to. And those same African partners would be foolish to count on Russian support if there was a chance that its waypoint could simply be taken away at a moment's notice. See the current situation in Syria. By contrast, Khalifa Haftar in Libya appears to have no intention of getting in Moscow's way, and he's both militarily and diplomatically stable enough in his position that it's not likely a base in southern Libya would come under threat anytime soon. With Russian support and a deepening of economic ties, Moscow can even ensure that eastern Libya remains under friendly control. That process is helped along by the fact that Libya's vast, sparsely populated deserts and its relatively low population are a barrier to the sorts of sweeping military offensives that work in smaller, denser places like Syria. Russia's new presence in Chad and its influence in Sudan only help to increase the appeal of Libya as a power center. Finally, Libya also has the Mediterranean coastline, including parts under Haftar's control, where Russia could very easily place a naval port if the diplomatic side of things were worked out. That would supplement or potentially even replace Russia's naval base in Tartus, which is currently its only foothold to place naval elements in the Mediterranean Sea. Across Africa, there are growing signs that Russia is taking a holistic approach to building its influence, with new activity becoming especially relevant in the nation of Mali. Their open-source intelligence indicates that a major Russian convoy passed through the nation's capital in mid-January, counting almost 60 armored vehicles, tanks, and anti-aircraft cannons among their number. That material appears to have come directly from Russia, rather than being material sent away from Syria, indicating, in turn, that Russia's committing more forces and more equipment to the African continent. Flight data indicates that Russian aircraft have flown from Libya to Mali more frequently, possibly to deposit some of this equipment, while other equipment likely came by sea to the small Russian ally of Guinea on the Atlantic coast. That military equipment would likely have been allotted for Mali even before the fall of the Russian regime, but it's a telling sign anyhow, as a beefed-up presence in Mali would address concerns coming from the nation's military regime. In Mali, Wagner forces have taken significant losses and have seemed to resist the demand to integrate to the Russian Africa Corps, although they've since come to a compromise with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Meanwhile, in Sudan, Russia is in the process of realigning itself away from the nation's breakaway paramilitary faction, the Rapid Support Forces, and pivoting toward the Sudanese military. There, Russia is closing in on a long-awaited port deal that would grant it access to the Red Sea coast, but would also provide significant benefit to Russia more broadly. Take a look at a map of Africa, overlay it with a map of Wagner and Africa Corps presence on the continent, and the situation becomes far easier to understand. Russia can leverage alliances in Guinea, in Mali, and in the neighboring military dictatorships of Niger and Burkina Faso, where it began operations in 2024. Then it seems to be building up a presence in Chad, as well as a more concretely government-aligned presence in Sudan. Put all of those connections together, and you can draw a land route across Africa, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, even leveraging Chadian territory to get to the Central African Republic. But two elements are missing. Rely on that network alone, and the Mediterranean is left out. And because of the logistical issues that we mentioned before, that entire connective chain can't be serviced by the Russian mainland with anything speedier than a cargo ship. Add Libya to the puzzle, and Russia arguably places itself in an even better long-term position than it had cultivated in Syria. Between its land bridge across the African continent, now touching two critical seas and an ocean all at once, and its ability to build Libya into a true military epicenter on its own terms, Russia has an opportunity to network the entire northern half of Africa into a major geopolitical asset. Not only that, but it gains access to immense natural resources and critical minerals, oil, gold, uranium, to support both its economic and military recovery from the war in Ukraine. That's a war it could restart sooner and suffer fewer long-term consequences for by leveraging both the physical and diplomatic interests it finds in Africa. All of that is possible because of Libya, and only because of Libya, stepping in to fill a role that Syrian territory no longer can. Keep Libya retain the loyalty and protection of Haftar, and build the nation's east into the military hub that Russia is seeking, and all of Africa is opened up for the long term. Open Africa for the long term, and Russia grows more powerful against Europe, more competitive with China, more menacing to Ukraine, and more valuable to its other global partners around the world. All of it hinges on Libya, and with Libya now decisively in play, there's no telling what Russian forces across Africa might be capable of. Thank you for watching.